about a virus and its effect on trade when I started studying trade a few decades ago. But I'll share with you some ideas and try and put them in an organized framework. And then absolutely, I want to be with you for any questions and comments that you might have. Let me start very much with the title. And we're talking about international trade law and policy amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. And the major theme that I would like to impress on all of us is that, or propose to all of us, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has created a brand new international trade law paradigm. No longer, ever again, will the world be focused on free trade, but instead the world is going to be focused much more on what we might call healthy trade. And that focus is going to be not only at the nation state level, India and the US, but also within the nation state. For example, Maharashtra or Missouri. I want to develop that theme first. And then I want to speak about from the change in the trade paradigm, the policy changes, to give you the specific legal examples at the multilateral, the free trade agreement level, and the national and subnational level, why I say we are now in a new healthy trade paradigm. Well, to start with that paradigmatic shift, the policy change. For most of the post-Second World War period, international trade policy has been dominated by free trade theory, which of course you study in your class. And that theory was developed in 1776 by Adam Smith and his law of absolute advantage, and in 1819 by David Ricardo and his law of comparative advantage. And the basic argument that Smith and Ricardo gave is that it is economically beneficial for a nation state to reduce, indeed eliminate, its tariff barriers and its non-tariff barriers to foreign imports, to do so unilaterally. And the economic benefits from free trade, from reducing or eliminating those trade barriers, come in two forms. First, the specialization of production, that world output will rise because each country is able to specialize in the production of a good or service in which it has a comparative cost advantage. So, for example, India and auto parts, and the US on advanced medical equipment, or Australia on wine or on wheat, and Bangladesh on ready-made garments. So world output of those items would rise, and the result in the rise in world output would be more consumer choice, more products available to all consumers at lower prices. So those have always been understood since Ricardo and Smith's time as the advantages of production specialization and increased consumer opportunities. And the Ricardo-Smith free trade paradigm drove the GATT in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, to which, of course, India was an original contracting party. And the free trade paradigm has dominated the post-Second World War rounds of trade negotiations, right through the Uruguay round. Now, of course, it started to grind to a halt with the Doha round. And so that thinking that comparative advantage, specialization of gains from trade, better consumption opportunities, That's been the paradigm we've been in. But even before the COVID virus, there were signs that that paradigm was in jeopardy. One clear sign was the increase in economic inequality caused by allegedly caused by free trade. That free trade was exacerbating income differences, income disparities, Gini coefficients, absolute poverty levels, top-bottom ratios in various countries. India, China, the US, France, were all getting worse as the world was liberalizing trade. And many economists, Thomas Piketty, for example, Danny Roddick, were saying, look, I think this free trade paradigm is not resulting in net benefits to society, but rather widening disparities. Now, to be fair, some of those negative externalities were really due to automation and technology, but trade was being blamed. A second deficiency in the paradigm that was arising before the COVID epidemic were degradations of labor rights and environmental rights. We saw countries like Mexico, Guatemala face challenges, unions with unionization, the beating up, sometimes the murder of trade unionists. We saw that trade wasn't exactly helping the labor movement. And it was also resulting in increased carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. And I certainly don't need to tell you in Delhi what happens usually sometime between November and January with greenhouse gas emissions and the atmosphere in Delhi. And we experienced some of that in many cities across the world. Well, there also was, pre-COVID, the SARS epidemic and the MERS epidemic. And so observers of trade started to wonder, is free trade a vector of disease? Is it possible that goods and the transport mechanisms for goods are causing the spread of disease? And of course, also those vectors include travel, people who are traveling for business or tourist reasons. So I don't want to say that the change from the free trade paradigm to the new healthy trade paradigm is entirely due to the COVID epidemic. That free trade paradigm was in trouble before November of 2019, when the COVID pandemic broke out in Wuhan, China. But now, without doubt, we are seeing countries retreat away from free trade. And they are saying, look, we cannot rely on foreign countries for essential goods and services. We have to make sure that our supply chains and all of the logistical arrangements with those supply chains are safe and preferably onshored, that we're not dependent on India or China, and likewise, India is not dependent on China or the US for its essential goods or services. And we've seen that very clearly with, as I'm going to show you, export restrictions that have been enacted both in India and in the US. And I'll also show you that in some other, with some other examples. Now, so that's one that's the big shift towards something that looks far more protectionist than we've seen since the end of the Second World War and the birth of the GATT. Now, notice that this discussion is cast at the nation state level, India, US. And that is generally how Ricardo and Smith conceived of free trade, that it was countries that trade. And likewise, in the new healthy trade paradigm, what I was suggesting is, again, we're operating at the nation state level. But I think there's something more about this new healthy trade paradigm, and that is that it's not just at the nation state level. It's also at the sub-central government level. That is to say, we are seeing sub-central government officials, for example, Governor Cuomo in New York, or the government in Punjab, ask the question, how can we be sure that we are safe? Our citizens in Punjab or our citizens in New York are safe by relying on supply chains that are domestic. We require, for harvesting our wheat, migrant labor from other parts of India, in Punjab. We require in New York supply chains stretching from Washington State or Oregon State on the West Coast for meat supplies or for N95 masks. But those supply chains are being disrupted even within the boundaries of a nation state. So what we're starting to see is a movement that is local, that trade is becoming even more decentralized from the nation state level, and it's becoming localized or regionalized within the nation state. So that's the big policy change that I wanted to propose to you thematically, from free trade to healthy trade. And then healthy trade has both national and subnational implications for supply chain logistics. Now, let me then turn to some examples of this shift in paradigm that we're seeing. And the examples come really from all three levels at which trade occurs, but especially from the third level. Now, trade law and policy, and trade occurs at the multilateral level, that is the World Trade Organization level. It occurs at the free trade agreement level, free trade agreements like the new US MCA, US Mexico-Canada agreement, which will enter into force on July 1st, or the RCEP, in which until recently India has been a part of. And it occurs at the domestic level, that is at the US or the Indian level, and also at the level of the state governments that I mentioned, giving examples like Missouri or Maharashtra or Punjab or New York. So let's turn to some examples of how we're seeing some movement away from free trade. Well, the World Trade Organization at the multilateral level, the highest level, if you will, published in April, and it's on its website, a new report on trade in medical goods in the context of tackling COVID-19. And it's freely downloadable. You can download it for free from the WTO website. And they pointed out a couple of facts. One is that the world is highly dependent on just a few countries for medical products, personal protective equipment, PPE, personal protective equipment. For example, Germany, the United States, and Switzerland supply 35% of all medical products. And China and Germany and the US are responsible for 40% of the PPEs. Medical products is the big category. The personal protective equipment, like the masks, is a subcategory, and they're a critical shortage nowadays across the healthcare systems of India and the US and around the world. And so basically you've got a situation in which the US, China, Germany, and Switzerland, four countries, are responsible for between a third and half of all the vital equipment that's needed for the likes of India to defeat the COVID virus. Another point that the WTO made is that the tariffs on some of the products, medical products and PPEs, remain very high. For example, on a very simple product, hand soap, the average applied tariff across all WTO members is 17%. Now, by US standards, that's a very high tariff. India's tariffs tend to be higher, but still 17% is a pretty hefty additional cost that consumers have to pay just for hand soap to do that 20-second wash with clean water that they're supposed to do routinely. In some WTO members, the applied tariffs are as high as 65% on soap. That's a whopping level. Now, the WTO also pointed out that in addition to this concentration of dependence on just 4 countries, and if you actually add the top 10 exporters of medical equipment, they account for 3/4 of world exports of medical equipment. So you add in Ireland and a few other countries, it's really just a story of a handful of countries. In addition to that, key point, in addition to the point about high tariffs on medical equipment, medical products, soap, the WTO also pointed out that the efforts to bring down, to free up trade on these vital products have been rather limited. There was, after the Uruguay round, or in the wake of the Uruguay round, an agreement, a plurilateral agreement that concerned medical products. It's so minor, we almost hardly pay attention to it when we study the Uruguay round. But it came out of the Uruguay round, and only a handful of countries actually joined it. It was a plurilateral agreement that I think involved ballpark about 17 or so countries. And it was called a pharma agreement, the agreement on pharmaceutical products. But it has really played almost no role in dealing with the pandemic, or for that matter, the previous SARS and MERS epidemic. So at the WTO level, we've not seen much in the way of freer trade. Instead, we've seen concentration of trade and persistent high trade barriers on vital medical products. With the death of the Doha round, as far back as a few years ago, I do not foresee any significant change in the state of affairs at the WTO. The WTO is basically, for the time being, and I don't say this with any joy, it's largely a paralyzed organization. We can talk about the causes of the paralysis. There's plenty of blame to spread around. And the paralysis is in all of its functions, including, of course, at the appellate body, which essentially no longer exists. But I don't think that there's any salvation coming from the WTO with respect to trade barriers on medical products or pharmaceuticals. Well, now we come to the free trade level. Has that been helpful in reducing trade barriers and encouraging countries to integrate more closely and realize Ricardo Smith benefits? I would say generally no. Now, Singapore and New Zealand recently concluded an agreement, a sectoral free trade agreement, if you want to call it that, in which they pledged not to raise trade barriers on medical equipment, pharmaceutical devices, PPEs. And that's a laudable effort by the New Zealand and the Singaporean governments. The problem is it's commercially insignificant. First of all, those are both two very small trading countries. Singapore, of course, is a city-state. And they do punch above their weight, to use the sports metaphor, in world trade. They are important voices in trade law and policy. But neither Singapore nor New Zealand are major producer exporters of medicines, medical equipment, or PPEs. So the fact that they're reducing trade barriers to each other doesn't really matter, because they are getting most of the gear that they need from third countries, not from each other. With respect to other free trade agreements, I mentioned the new NAFTA 2.0, which is entering into force in a couple of months on the 1st of July. It really does not speak to the COVID pandemic. The negotiations were concluded on it back in the summer and fall of 2018, and then a little bit into 2019. So the negotiations predated the pandemic. And basically the three countries have proceeded with their ratification processes to the USMCA. And they've also proceeded to pursue independent policies regarding fighting the pandemic. So I don't think you're seeing any innovation coming out of the North American free trade agreement. Likewise, just a quick survey, quick tour with RCEP, those negotiations have largely stalled following India's withdrawal, which I think was last fall. And there were never any efforts really to talk about improving trade in medical or pharmaceutical equipment. The European Union, as you know, has been fragmenting with Brexit. So there again, there's really no effort to resurrect free trade in medical and pharmaceutical goods through that customs union. The EU will be slimmed down at 27. Britain will go its own way, the former 28th member, and they will pursue their own independent policies. And those independent policies will include their own sanitary and phytosanitary SPS measures regarding what they deem as essential testing and certification. And let me pause on that point a little bit, because the SPS measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, are generally regulated, as you know from your study, by the WTO SPS agreement. And in fact, India has been a party to cases involving the SPS agreement, like the poultry case against the US. And you would expect, if we were thinking in the free trade paradigm, that what countries would do, either at the multilateral level or at the free trade agreement level, to accelerate the production, exportation, customs clearance, and importation and distribution of medical goods and medicines. What you'd expect countries would do is they would harmonize their SPS measures on those items, on pharmaceuticals, on PPEs, so that, for example, a mask or an N95 mask made in India or a generic medicine made in India would be exported expeditiously through to the US. US Customs and Border Protection and the US Food and Drug Administration would certify Indian production and testing standards and laboratory facilities as equivalent to America's, and bring those equipment in through the ports, through customs, and get them to the hospitals and the patients they need, whether in Kansas City or New York, across the country. Well, that's not happening. We are not seeing what we call in trade MRAs, mutual recognition agreements. We're not seeing a strong effort by governments to quickly negotiate and finalize mutual recognition agreements with each other so that they can get those goods through testing and certification procedures and recognize each other. Instead, we're still seeing the view that, well, if it's made in India, we need to retest it, or we need to recertify it, or we need to re-examine the lab, and perhaps vice versa. Now, I'm not saying that we should, by any means, compromise the quality of the testing in order to expedite products or medicines that might be unsafe or unsanitary. Of course not. But this is a time for the trade negotiators, in a way, to step aside and let the scientists take over, the doctors take over, come to the negotiating table and let the doctors on the US and on the Indian side, for example, say, look, we know each other's labs, we know each other's testing facilities. Many of us were schooled in the same medical schools and universities. We can trust each other, at least for the next 90 days. Let's recognize mutually each other's standards. So we're not seeing that. Now, that's partly because of a broader problem at the free trade agreement level. And that is, despite the rhetoric from the US and Indian governments, and I'm not in any way meaning to say anything negative about any leader. I mean, I mean to speak in a very non-partisan, non-ad hominem way. But despite the rhetoric from both the Indian Prime Minister and the American President about being interested in a free trade agreement, there has been next to no progress on that. You can only imagine how grand it would have been if during the first few visits between the Indian and American leaders, if they had negotiated an FTA that covered COVID-19 related products. That would have been almost a far-sighted agreement had they done that last year, but they didn't. And even in the most recent trip in February, that was rather disappointing. When President Trump visited Prime Minister Modi, that was rather disappointing in terms of any kind of trade agreement outcome, much less MRAs on medical products. So at the free trade agreement level, like the multilateral level, not much has been happening. So what about at the third and final level, the domestic policy level? What's been going on? Well, let me start with a quote from the spokesperson on health policy for the Social Democrat Party in Germany. Now, as you know, Germany is led by Chancellor Angela Merkel, and the junior partner in Germany's coalition government is the Social Democratic Party. And what Karl Lauterbach, the health policy spokesman, said in March 2020 is this: excuse me, capitalism has its limits. Capitalism has its limits. That's what Karl Lauterbach tweeted. Now, what he was reacting to was a report that the United States was trying to lure a German company that was researching a vaccine against the COVID-19 virus to move that company's operations from Germany to the US so that that company would provide a supply of successful coronavirus treatments that it discovers, if it does, exclusively to the United States. And so Germany, which you might recall from the statistics I mentioned from the WTO, is one of the top 4 exporters of medical products. Germany was fearing that the US would seek a monopoly on any breakthrough in the fight against the disease. And so the Germans basically took action to try and prevent their company, a company known as CureVac, from leaving the US, or leaving Germany, I should say, from being taken over by a US company. So we're seeing now on the foreign direct investment side at the national level, countries second guess foreign takeovers of medically strategic companies that would then cause those foreign companies to buy the domestic company and relocate to a foreign jurisdiction. The possible takeover by America of Germany's CureVac being an example. You probably also have been reading in the Indian press that the Indian government is concerned that there may be opportunistic takeovers by China, directed by the Communist Party, of Indian companies that may have strategic value to India. So we're seeing already at the domestic level foreign direct investment restrictions. Now we're seeing another set of trade barriers, again in this new healthy trade paradigm, that concerns export bans, outright export bans or quantitative restrictions. Now you might remember from your study, GATT Article 11, Paragraph 1. It's one of the pillars of GATT. GATT Article 11, Paragraph 1 is a generic rule against quantitative restrictions. All quantitative restrictions are presumptively forbidden, and quantitative restrictions include import and export bans. And normally we don't think much about countries wanting to ban their own exports. Rather, in a free trade paradigm, we think countries will want to export, gain export revenues, and then reinvest those export revenues into the domestic economy. That's certainly been part of the Far East countries, the East Asian Tigers growth story, and that's been increasingly since the 1991 reforms in India, part of the Indian growth story. But now we're starting to see export restraints on medical and pharmaceutical products, and India is an example. China is the source for about 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, the essential raw materials that Indian companies need to make finished medicines. So India's pharma sector is reliant in its supply chain for 80% of the ingredients of the medicines it needs on China. That is a very dangerous dependency in the view of the Indian government. And also, India's got a very important position in world markets. India is the largest maker of generics. It accounts by volume of about 20%, for about 20% of the world's total supply of medicines. So India quickly realized early in this outbreak of the pandemic that its leading position in the world market for generics, 20% of world market by volume, is entirely dependent, 80%, on getting APIs, the ingredients, from China. So India then took action. India decided that in March that it would restrict exports of any APIs that it makes domestically. India did not want to see its own domestically made APIs go abroad. It also, India did ban exportation of paracetamol, vitamins B1 and B12, antibiotics, certain antibiotics. In fact, 26 different APIs and other medicines were banned by the Indian government from exportation. And India drew up a list of 373 medicines, drugs, that it considered essential, and pointed out that for 200 of them, it really could not do without the Chinese supply chain. So certainly India was going to ban exportation of those ingredients that it made domestically. Now, what would India's defense be legally under the GATT? Well, I mentioned GATT Article 11.1 would actually say that the Indian export restrictions were illegal, but GATT Article 11.2 2A in particular, allows for a country, a GATT member, WTO member, to restrict exportation of items temporarily if they are in critical shortage and they are foodstuffs, well, medicines aren't foodstuffs, of course, or other essential products. So the Indian defense would be that this is temporary, the export restraint. It is essential to our health and welfare, and it is it's a critical food product. It's a critical non-foodstuff product. India then, the next month, this month actually, April 4th, it banned, it took another step. It banned the exportation of hydroxychloroquine. And hydroxychloroquine, or HCl, is a yet unproven cure for COVID-19. It's basically a medicine that is used to treat malaria, and it's been touted by some as possibly a treatment for COVID. Again, unproven, but India wanted to be sure that if it is proven to be effective, hydroxychloroquine would be in ample domestic supply, not in critical shortage, to use the GATT Article 11.2a term, not in critical shortage domestically. So the Prime Minister then, putting together these March and April export bans, declared what was called a China +1 strategy, presumably India being the +1, where India would be increasingly self-reliant, not entirely, not autarkic, but more self-reliant on its own supplies of APIs and medicines. Now, many of you, and if you've not done this, when the lockdown in India is over, I really encourage you to do this. It was one of the most interesting things I've done on my many trips to New Delhi. Go and see the house in which Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, lived. And you'll see there in Delhi, beautiful house, many pictures of her life, including her prime ministership, and you'll see many newspaper stories written about her. And back in the early 1970s, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi made many statements, and they're chronicled in her house, hanging on the wall in the newspaper stories, that India should be self-reliant for medicines and pharmaceuticals as well as food. She was making the point that India should not be dependent on the West, on former colonial powers, on the United States, nor on the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, for these essential products. And she's making these statements in the early and mid 1970s, before the emergency period. And you look at that history that's part of all of us as Indians, whether non-resident Indians like myself or like all of you in India. And it's really amazing to see how far-sighted she was. Because what India is doing today, what Prime Minister Modi is doing today, different party, different political philosophy. I mean, BJP in Congress could not be more different, right? But the same policy initiative that we need to be increasingly self-reliant. We can't depend on free trade for these products. And that's what we're seeing today. It's really fascinating. Let me give you some US examples, because the US is doing the same thing. And you will note that the US trade representative, sometimes for good reason, is fond of criticizing India for its anti-free trade measures in various forms: technical barriers to trade, high applied tariff rates, water in the tariff schedule, all sorts of reasons, subsidies. But we also need to be clear that the US is engaging in some of the same practices today with respect to securing the domestic supply chain. And the president, President Trump, in this month and last month, invoked a law which is from 1950 called the Defense Production Act, the DPA. And the DPA authorizes the president to intervene in the free market and mandate that a private sector business give priority to the US government in the contracts of that private sector business for any materials that the US government deals necessary for national defense. So to be specific, we're talking about the American president intervening in the free market to order a company to deliver merchandise necessary for the national defense to the government, notwithstanding the fact that that company has a contract to deliver those products, sell them and produce and sell them to a private sector buyer. And the government can also, the US government under the president's direction, can also allocate resources. He can say, I want certain inputs not to go to the private sector, but instead to go to producing goods that the government requisitions. The president can also order the construction of new factories, installing equipment at factories to produce goods that are deemed essential for national defense. And of course, the president can intervene to block mergers and acquisitions that I mentioned earlier that threaten national security. Now, I mentioned the irony of a BJP prime minister engaging in policies that were foreseen by a Congress prime minister almost 50 years ago. Well, here's an irony on the American side. We have a Republican president who's not happy about intervening in the private sector, doing so under a 1950 law that was passed under a Democratic president, President Harry Truman, the former mayor of Kansas City, where I sit now. And President Truman invoked the DPA, Defense Production Act, during the Korean War to essentially commandeer steel so that steel would go to the war effort during the Korean War. And he also intervened to order factories stay open to produce steel, and he resolved some labor management disputes. So this is a radical intervention in the free market. Well, on the 18th of March, President Trump defined ventilators and productive equipment as essential to the national defense. Ventilators and productive equipment. So that meant N95 masks. And a few days later, on the 2nd of April, President Trump ordered 3M, that's the Minneapolis-based company that makes like Scotch tape and the sticky pads, yellow sticky pads, General Electric and Medtronic, two other companies, to increase their production of those N95 respirator masks. He also, through the Federal Emergency Management Association, blocked exportation of 5 types of personal protective merchandise: the N95 masks, as well as surgical masks and certain gloves, saying they are scarce, threatened materials. He later allowed for some modest exportation of those items, for example, to Canada and Mexico, and within the government, for example, to the military or to US embassies overseas. But basically, we have an export ban on those products. Now, that again is an extraordinary intervention in which basically what we're seeing is a rather free market oriented administration saying, we don't believe in the free market to supply us with necessary products. We're going to have to safeguard our own supply. Now, recently, as in 2 days ago, we saw one more example of the invocation of the DPA. It has not yet resulted in an export ban, but it wouldn't surprise me if it does. And this concerns the food supply. And in particular, it concerns beef, eggs, pork, and poultry supplies. In other words, meat products. Basically, upwards of 22 meat processing facilities in the United States, concentrated in places like Iowa, states like Iowa, which produce about 30% of America's pork supply, have been closed. And the reason they've been shuttered is because the workers themselves in the meatpacking facilities have been diagnosed with the coronavirus. And we've actually seen 20 people die in the meatpacking sector and 6,500 infected by the virus. And so we could see in the coming days, 80% of US meat production capacity could shut down completely. And so the president a few days ago ordered that the meat processing facilities stay open. Well, he decided that meat processing was part of the critical infrastructure, part of the national security infrastructure. Now, I don't mean to poke fun at this, but I will just say as a personal note, I'm a lifelong vegetarian. And so I found it a little amusing that meat processing was somehow part of the critical national defense infrastructure. I can see the argument for N95 masks or ventilator machines. But the pedagogical point, the more substantive professional point to make is that when countries start taking export restrictions and justifying them under the language of critical or essential products, we, that is all of us as lawyers, have to ask, what do we mean by critical or essential products? Because are we starting down a slippery slope whereby almost any product could be deemed essential for national security? And if we're down that slippery slope, then what is left of global trade relations? When at a moment's notice, a president or a prime minister can simply order a rather draconian intervention in the free market. Basically, to sum up the points, we're seeing at the multilateral free trade agreement level and domestic level, significant interventions, particularly at the domestic level, I should say, in the free market in the form of quantitative restrictions. Now, to wrap up, because I definitely want to have lots of time for questions and answers, there are some other examples, which I didn't mention, of this move from free trade away from free trade towards healthy trade. One is in the area of subsidies. We're seeing more and more countries contemplate or actually outright provide subsidies to enterprises and industries. The US has been through 4 or 5 rounds of stimulus bills. Some of them are targeting particular industries. I've been following the debate that's very well reported in the Indian media, on Bloomberg Quint and other venues, about the fiscal stimulus that the Indian government is contemplating and the need to monetize that fiscal stimulus. The RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, is going to have to basically print rupees to finance India's upcoming fiscal deficit. And a lot of the spending is going to be on helping afflicted Indian industries. Well, those subsidies, if they are, as you know from your study of the WTO SCM agreement, Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, those subsidies if they're specific to enterprises or industries, may violate. They may be illegal as red light or yellow light subsidies. And there's no longer a dark amber category that gives them some rebuttable presumptions against injury or serious prejudice. So subsidies is another area to watch out for the effects of the COVID pandemic. And then finally, services trade is another area where we're seeing likely more restrictions, particularly on modes 2, 3, and 4, but not on mode 1. What I mean by that is we're seeing more countries likely to enact restrictions on travel, business travel, visa granting. That would be, or setting up foreign direct investments. That would be modes 2, 3, and 4. Mode 2 is, consumption abroad. Mode 3 is FDI, and mode 4 is temporary migration. And I don't think you're going to see much liberalization on those modes. But what you will see is exactly what we're doing, what your dean very kindly set up, and that's mode 1, and that's delivery of services via online platforms where the service supplier and the service consumer stay in their home jurisdictions. I think we'll see limited services trade mobilization just on mode 1, but protection on modes 2, 3, and 4. So let me conclude by again thanking you very much for the opportunity to be with you and share some ideas. I think I want to make sure that you, despite the current pandemic, and as dark as the times sometimes look, on a very positive point, and that is whenever there's risk, whenever there's some uncertainty, there's also great opportunity. And all of you are living through a time in which you have the opportunity to see and be part of and shape future trade rules. And you will look back in a few years at this time and say, wow, I lived through that. I got through that with my family and my teachers and my dean. And I learned a lot. And I now am in a better position as a trade lawyer to go and help India and help the world. The experience, though difficult and dark, with some very deadly effects, also has some upsides that you can take advantage of. So with that, let me pause and turn it back over to our dean and our moderator, and just ask for any questions or comments.
So thank you so much, sir. And your views on the impact of COVID-19 on international free trade are indeed enlightening. COVID-19 has indeed created a wide change, and you have pointed out how these changes apply not only to nations, but also the provinces and states of these countries. You have taken us through the journey of history of international trade law and have related that to the current pandemic. And you have very well pointed out how protectionism is becoming the norm, and that there's a movement away from free trade, and indeed capitalism has its limits. And of course, the extensive use of NSA to classify critical and essential products seems to need some regulation. Otherwise, as you said, we are on a slippery slope, and the president or a PM could simply order a draconian intervention in the free market. And of course, more countries are providing subsidies to enterprises. And India's RBI is printing more rupees, which is something that even I wasn't aware of, and which may indeed affect the economy negatively. And the subsidies may also violate the SCM agreement, as you have pointed out, sir. So thank you, sir. We are now in a better position to understand the pandemic and related with international trade law. Now I'll just point out some of the questions that have come from the students. So student Lena is asking, do you think as to whether it is likely that to protect domestic producers, countries may place tariffs on foreign-made testing kits for COVID-19?
So I want to make sure I understand the question, and correct me if I'm wrong. The question is to protect the domestic supply of testing kits. A country might impose an export constraint. You mean some sort of export tax to prevent the exportation of the kits? Or do you mean that an importing country would levy a tariff?
An importing country, sir.
Well, if the testing kits, let's say, for example, are being made in France, and India is importing them from France, India would want to facilitate the trade of those testing kits. So India would not want to impose a tariff on the French originating testing kits. Rather, it would want to reduce, preferably to zero, and make those testing kits cheaper to the Indian healthcare sector. So in the importing position, no, India would not want to impose the tariff. Now, there's a counter argument to that, which would be if Indian industries are producing testing kits and they are facing competition from the French, and the French competition is underpricing them. I'm not saying they're dumping, but they're underpricing them. And India's got, let's say, an infant industry that is trying to grow and develop amidst this fierce French competition. Then the Indian industry might lobby the central government for tariff protection from the French products, from the French-like product. Then I would expect that the public health community would intervene and would say, look, we're the consumers of the testing kits. We need them. And of course, it's nice to have, as the Prime Minister calls it, make in India. But right now, we don't worry about whether it's made in India or not. We just need the testing kit. So imposing the levy on French goods is against the patient's interests, the consumer's interests. And then you'd have your classic battle between the domestic producer of the like product, the testing kit, wanting protection, and the consumer groups, the public health sector in India, not wanting protection. And how that plays out would be a matter of the political process in Delhi.
So the next, I think that's the answer. I think that's done. So Arushi Anand has another question. She asks, should countries adopt protectionist measures in policies for a few months after the COVID-19 crisis ends in order to allow the domestic economy, which would have taken a serious damage as a result of the measures, such as lockdown taken by the national governments in some countries?
Okay, so if I get the question right, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that post-pandemic, should countries implement some temporary protectionist measures to give their industries and their farmers time to get back on their feet, as it were, and resume their normal operations? Well, that's a great question, and I think that's in the minds of a lot of policymakers. I think answering it as an economist and as a lawyer, I would say that the protectionist measures would not be the first best solution. The first best solution would be offering direct fiscal support, that is subsidies, to those afflicted companies. And the subsidies can take a variety of forms. For example, farmers who've not been able to sell their product the government could step in and buy their product and store it to the extent it's storable. Some products are not, like fresh milk. Store it and then provide it, say, to food banks for poorer people. Industries making manufactured goods or service businesses could get government support of one form or another, like the U.S. has already done in its last two stimulus bills. But intervening in a protectionist way to distort further patterns of trade is problematic for a few reasons. One is these so-called temporary protections tend to be sticky. They tend to stay on for a long period. I mean, one of the examples of that is India's own history with the license Raj system after in the 1950s through about the early 1990s. Another example is U.S. protections through quotas on sugar, which have been going on since at least 1949. So I would worry about the temporary nature of these protections if it's really temporary. Second, it's subject to retaliation. So if the U.S. enacts protections against, for example, Indian auto parts producers, well, India can do the same thing against the U.S. And then we get into a trade war that actually, contrary to our mutual interests, makes the post-pandemic recovery more difficult. If we're trying to all get out of this recovery through stimulus, we're actually going to dampen demand by reciprocal rounds of trade retaliation. So that'd be my second concern about taking the protectionist route. But it is probably something that governments are certainly contemplating. Yes.
So thank you so much. The next question happens to be from Jagriti Vij. She asks, would the hit during the coronavirus, would the hit be worse than the last global crisis seen during 2008 and 9? And I would add to that, and what change could it lead to how countries see international trade law or perceive international trade law?
I think, and here I want to again, confess my limits. I'm not a professional macroeconomist or econometric forecaster, so I read, the forecast that you all are also reading and participate in webinars and learn from the pros on this. But I think the answer, the first part of that question, is the economic impact of the coronavirus worse than that of the global financial crisis? I think the answer is a pretty clear yes. If you look at the fall in gross domestic product in Q1 of 2020 and the projected fall for Q2 in 2020, in the US, in India, other major economies, and worldwide, those falls on quarterly basis and definitely on annualized bases are worse than what we saw in the 2008 crisis. And in a more human level, even, the unemployment rates are worse. They are approaching the levels of the Great Depression. The levels I've seen of unemployment in this country, in the US, are in the 16% range. And likewise, I've seen in India, estimates of 10 to 20%. Those are, and those are probably understated, because as you know, roughly 3/4 of the Indian labor force is working informally, if you will, with families or with small and medium-sized farms and enterprises, and they're not necessarily showing up in the official statistics as part of the formal labor force and actively seeking jobs. And I think that story is being played out in many countries of high unemployment rates. So in terms of fall in GDP and rise in unemployment, yes, worse than the GFC. In terms of recovery, the famous trademarked Nike symbol, the swoosh, the check mark of a steep fall in quarters 1, 2, and 3, followed by a slow recovery, is the famous symbol that is being used as a metaphor for the recovery. So this is a recovery that may take well into 2021 and even 2022 before we start seeing pre-COVID GDP and unemployment levels back to where they were. A lot is going to depend on fiscal stimulus. This is where, for those of you who like to dive into this is where monetary theory, modern monetary theory, MMT, is very interesting, because it's basically telling policymakers, don't worry about inflation effects, do not worry about deficits, fund the deficits, and stimulate the economy. That was the first part of the question. The second part of the question, the effects on trade law and policy. Well, I would just kind of return to what I mentioned earlier, that I don't see a resumption of sort of the GATT WTO free trade paradigm anytime soon. I think we're, for the next several years, in a much more cautious, semi-protectionist paradigm that focuses on public health and national security. I think that the way to put that is, trade policy is about public health and national security. It is not just about free trade.
Thank you, sir. The next question comes directly from Dr. Rashmi ma'am. So she asked, wouldn't a policy of self-reliance be against the free trade policy and ideals, since it would push them into a shell of mercantilist tendencies?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree entirely with the question and its premise. Self-reliance is exactly what Ricardo and Smith were arguing against. The way self-reliance is often expressed in terms of policy, as Dr. Rashmi's question rightly points out, is through mercantilist policies, whereby countries try and maximize exports and minimize imports, thereby generating as much export revenue as possible and investing that export revenue in their economies and sometimes in their militaries. And if every country were to pursue a mercantilist policy, well, it could not possibly work, because every country cannot generate an export surplus. Some countries are going to be deficits, some countries are going to be surplus countries, and those countries will change over time. And moreover, from a national security perspective, even though it is almost, it's short-term, it's a short-term seduction that mercantilism will enhance our national security because it gives us revenues to strengthen our military. In the long run, it can result in countries retreating into their own armed fortresses and viewing each other with greater and greater suspicion. And when they happen upon an item that they cannot produce domestically, like, for example, rare earths, then they may go on a military adventurous policy of trying to take over, or directly or indirectly, a country, strengthen its influence in a country to get those rare earths. So it's a very dangerous track to go on. I agree entirely with the question. Yes. I think you're muted. Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Thank you so much, sir. I was. So the next question, of course, comes from one of our faculties, Mr. Suhas. He's asking, what, in your view, would be the role played by the waiver provisions in the WTO agreement and GATT in the post-COVID crisis world?
That's a great question, Professor. Thank you. If I understand, you're saying, could the waivers, for exceptional circumstances under GATT Article 25, be used, and various other waiver provisions in WTO agreements? That's an excellent question, and I confess I had not thought of that. To get a waiver, you need support from the WTO. You need to get, I forgot the exact threshold, but it's something like a 2/3 or 3/4 approval, something like that, or have to get a consensus for the waiver. And the waiver may come with conditions, and that is the country seeking the waiver may need to provide some appropriate compensation. There may be some compensatory adjustment. So I guess, and this is a very incomplete answer, I apologize. I think the waiver provisions are there and available to be used, but they are cumbersome in that they would take some time. They might require some sacrifice by the requesting country. And I would expect that in the heat of this crisis, countries will simply take the measure they needed and not seek prior waiver approval. And then, as necessary, they'll seek forgiveness later. They won't worry about the formalities of the law right now. That would be my incomplete speculative, thought.